In this session, we will begin our journey into the Gospels. These are exciting texts, and for most of us, probably represent the culmination or the climax of our understanding of the Bible. And so we're going to come to them, and as we do so, I'm going to offer some perspectives and hopefully some things that might enrich your experience of the Gospels. So let's just dive in and get started. We'll have several sessions devoted specifically to the Gospels. Today, or in this session, we'll do a very kind of a broad approach to the Gospels as we begin to look at them. So here we go. One thing to just note is the very word gospel itself. The word means good news, and I think we all understand that it is used as a word to convey the reality that Jesus is good news, the message, his life, the deeds, the things that he has done, particularly all of that culminating in his death and resurrection, and then later his ascension. This is good news. This is God's good news to us in the relationship and the fulfillment of the covenant, and God reaching out and letting us reach out and in fact see what God is like, to have this incredible physical way of touching Jesus, of hearing him, and having his story told. So the word itself is a beautiful word. In a literary sense, it is also a word that many think, and I certainly agree, only applies to Jesus. For example, we could talk about a number of fascinating and wonderful figures in history, and people who made some very life-changing differences. But none of them, I don't think we would talk about in terms of gospel. But when it comes to Jesus, it is a term that certainly applies to him. It is a term that most definitely is about Jesus, but not a term neither about the story that is told about him, nor the literary devices in which they come packaged, that is the Gospels, for example, of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in the way they come to us framed in a certain literary way. Not only is the message good news, but the way that they have come to us, the way that they present themselves to us in the Bible, the way that we come to them, are known as Gospels as well. So there's some historical context that go along with this. One obvious is this, that the event, the person of the Gospel is Jesus. There's certainly a number of other cast members in the story, disciples and others, but the centerpiece of the gospel is none other than the story of Jesus himself. What is interesting about this whole thing of gospel is that Jesus himself never wrote a gospel. As a matter of fact, we have nothing that has been preserved or passed down to us if he wrote anything at all. And so one of the issues that we have to kind of think about historically is that what we have in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not things that Jesus himself wrote. They are things that were written about him, and they were things that were written about him at a later time. So the original and foremost historical context for the Gospels is the very event of Jesus, or the very appearance or mission and ministry of Jesus himself. Another historical context that we have to think about when we are dealing with the Gospels is that the authors or the writers of each of the Gospels have their own historical context. Since they weren't acting as on-the-spot reporters and historians, and this wasn't being videographed or taped in any way, and some time had passed between the event or the person of Jesus and the time in which the stories were actually written, compiled, and all of those kinds of things. There is the historical situation of the writer of the gospel itself. These were not four guys who kind of huddled together and discussed, in as much as we know, what each of them were going to write per se. They were scattered and they had their own historical moments in which they lived. They had their own audience to which they were writing. And when you tell Jesus stories, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is not only are we talking about the particular historical moment of Jesus himself, we are also talking about the historical moment of when each of the writers wrote, and to whom they were writing, and how that shapes the way that they told a Jesus story. Another historical moment to think about is your historical moment and ours. We are in the 21st century, and yet the Jesus stories are stories that captivate us, that we gravitate to, stories that we lean into, that we read, we are still fascinated by, we are transformed by Jesus himself, and there is our own historical context. And as, in my case, a Western reader of a text, I have to realize and keep in mind that the way I read a Jesus story, the way I would read a first century document, must be, in a sense, translated into 21st century understanding and language. This is not about changing the story of Jesus at all. This is about understanding that I am not in the first century. I do not have a first century mindset, or would probably even understand a first century mindset. So I am a 21st century reader, as you are, reading the centerpiece story of the mission of God that happened in the first century. And as we approach the Gospels, it is helpful for us to keep in mind that we have these various levels of historical contexts in which things happen. The level in which it actually happened in the event, in the person, in the life of Jesus himself. The telling of that some years later from the author, from Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. The reading of that in a 21st century world. I'm going to take a few moments and talk about what are potentially some misconceptions or misunderstandings of the Gospels. And these kinds of things are fairly simple, and yet they are the kinds of things that are usually off our radar when we are thinking about Gospels. We usually don't think of them in these kinds of terms. So let me mention 4 or 5 of these. One is this: the Gospels are not biographies of the life of Jesus. In our culture, we have a very good understanding. Don't have to explain what a biography is. You can go to any bookstore, just about any person, historical figure that you are interested in. You could probably easily enough find a biography about that person. somebody who's researched, somebody who's interested in that person, somebody who has studied that person, somebody who writes, somebody who understands history, somebody who knows how to present the story or the impact or the legacy of that person. But it would certainly be easy enough to find a biography on any historical figure of any significance. And as such, it is very tempting for us to think that when we turn to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it is the same as if we were reading the biography of Jesus. That this is like the telling of a great military leader or political leader or business leader, but we just, in our case, as people of faith, we just have these things called Gospels, and we read them, we are reading the biography of Jesus. It is not the case that the Gospels are biographies of Jesus. The truth is, if you lay down the Gospels, just you can pick any of the Gospels or just kind of go through all four of them and lay beside that a biography of any person of interest to you, it would not take you very long to see that there are very significant differences in the ways that the Gospels present the Jesus story, and what you may or may not find in a gospel, and then the way that a modern biography would present the story of a historical figure. And in sessions to come, we're going to point some of these out, but for this opening session, as we approach the Gospels, just sufficient to point out to you that the Gospels are not biographies in the way that in Western culture we think about biographies. And that will be a very significant thing to keep in your forefront as you approach the Gospels. That does not mean that they do not have biographical things. They most certainly do. We get a biographical sense, and we get picture of Jesus, and we get things that he said and places he went and things that he has done. And we get all of that, and we get this crucifixion and his death and the significance of that, and his resurrection 3 days later. All of those are certainly biographical, but the way that the stories are told are not in the form of a contemporary Western biography. And the other things that I'll mention kind of flow out of this. The Gospels do not follow a strict chronological order. And you've probably noticed this in your encounter with the Gospels. But again, if you just take the Gospels and lay them out, there are just a number of places that would be quite easily to see that none of the Gospel writers were attempting to write a strictly chronological order presentation of Jesus. In other words, we get the basic flow of his life. We know about things like his birth and an event of when he was 12, the beginning of his ministry. We get the flow of his ministry, but we do not have a strict chronology of on this specific date he said this thing or he was at this place. And within the Gospels themselves, the order of events or the order of sayings, the things that Jesus said, will vary. And let me just say right out of the chute on this that there's no concern, there's no need to be worried about this. This is not an alarm bell going off. This is simply saying that we have 21st century understandings and expectations of texts and stories when we read them. And oftentimes we take those understandings or expectations and we transpose them all the way back to the first century world and drop them in a place, in a time, in a setting in which they were not the expectation, or it was not the way that things were told or reported or shared. So, no alarm whatsoever, no problem. It does not diminish in any way. As a matter of fact, as we'll see in sessions to come, if anything, it just increases the intensity, the beauty, the power of the way that Jesus' stories are told. But for the moment, just keep in mind that they are not told in strict chronological order. Again, flowing out of that, because they are not told in strict chronological order, it is impossible to have a complete harmony of the Gospels. Some people have tried to take all four Gospels and take a piece here and then find in another Gospel which seems to be the most likely next event or next to saying in the life of Jesus, and try to piece, using all four Gospels, try to create one coherent, logical, complete account of Jesus. Well, the Gospels refuse that. They just won't allow you to do that. There's no way to take this part of a Gospel and put it up against another part of a Gospel and try to somehow figure out what was the exact wording that Jesus used, or what was the exact order in which things happened. What if you take all of the events, all of the sayings from all of the Gospels, and somehow out of that construct or create one story, one gospel? What you are doing, or what some have tried to do, is create this harmony out of the four various Gospels. Again, please rest assured, this is not something at all to be alarmed about. As we will see, this is something, again, that just helps us to understand and appreciate the revelation of God and the inspiration, and how credible these historical accounts are, or the stories of Jesus are. So let me encourage you to resist the temptation that a number of people have had in trying to deal with the reality that we have four Gospels rather than one. Resist the temptation of trying to take the four Gospels that we have and somehow create this one overarching gospel that just kind of fills in all the details, fills in all the blanks, as if by using all four Gospels you could construct or create a complete storyline of the life and ministry of Jesus. Also, number 4, let me just lay it out for you. And again, this is not an alarm. That when we approach the Gospels, or when we are reading the Gospels, to keep in mind that the Gospels are not objective accounts of the life of Jesus or the story of Jesus. And what I mean by that is that the writers of each of the Gospels were individuals that had their own faith stories, and they were writing about Jesus' stories to a particular community of faith or to a particular audience. But they were not doing it in the modern sense of trying to be objective about it all. They were doing it in light of who God was and God's revelation and what God had done in the past. They did it in light of the reality that this was the Son of God, that there was something very earthly about him. He came in the form of a man, but there was something also very unearthly about him as well. And all of this kind of comes together, and when the writers, the authors of the four Gospels tell their stories of Jesus, they do so from decidedly a perspective of faith. So as you're reading the Gospels, keep in mind that they're not trying to be, in our cultural understanding, objective accounts of the life of Jesus. They are told from the perspective of faith in Jesus. Finally, you may want to keep in mind too, because this has been a temptation with people throughout history, and there have been examples of this that are blaring, but there is also an undercurrent that happens to a lot of us when we do this, that when we come to Jesus' stories, there is a temptation to think, okay, now we have come to the end of the law. And this is the beginning, since the gospel is the good news, this is the beginning of God's grace or God's love. And sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that everything up to Jesus is all of a sudden dismissed, it's over, it's done. It does not, that nothing carries over, that nothing is of weight, that really what we need to focus on are the Gospels and then the subsequent stories that we have, or the subsequent books that we have in the New Testament. This would be very short-sighted. The story of God, the mission of God, does not come up to Jesus, stop, and then introduce God's grace as if it had never been there, or as if God's grace wasn't there for Abraham or for Moses or for anybody else prior to the time of Jesus. What happens in the Gospels is that we have the beginning of the fulfillment of that which we had read in the story leading up to Jesus and all of the things from Old Testament perspective. So please don't see, as you approach Jesus' stories, that nothing that happened before that is now relevant. The truth is that as you're reading through the Gospels, if you just listen for echoes and phrases and words and images and symbols and songs that actually are rooted in the Old Testament, you will see that you can hardly go anywhere in a Jesus story or actually in the New Testament without realizing that all of this is deeply, deeply rooted in the texts that were before the Gospels, the texts that tell the story of God that lead up to Jesus. There is an incredible connection, and don't make the mistake of thinking that the Jesus story is the beginning of something that is disconnected in any way from all that had preceded it. So, keep some of those things in mind. That will help you as you come to the Gospels. Let me, in conclusion in this session, or as we approach our conclusion, mention some tensions and things you might also need to think about. One is the word gospel and the word gospels. The word gospel, as we've already mentioned, means good news. The gospels refer to the literary context or the literary form in which the story of the gospel itself is told. So we have one gospel. That is, we have one story of Jesus. But we have four gospels. We have four ways in which the gospel, the story of Jesus, has been transmitted to us and is presented to us in the New Testament. And here is probably one that could be the most significant. The theme of what Jesus did and all that he said is wrapped up in the statement or the phrase, the kingdom of God, the rule of God. And when we are approaching the Jesus stories, or quite honestly anything in the New Testament, it would be very, very helpful to keep this in mind, and I'll diagram it out in a very simple way. In the Old Testament, I'll just use something of an oval to illustrate it. There was what could be considered this age. And the anticipation was, and the hope was, that there would be a day that God would send his Messiah, and this would be the age to come. This would be the time in which all things would be made new, everything is reconciled, the justice of God has come, and there would be, obviously, something would have to happen to transition from this age to the age to come. And this was oftentimes thought of as the day of the Lord. So, you could probably, just seeing this alone, you could probably see that it's something of a challenge to people when Jesus shows up and he announces the kingdom of God is at hand. The kingdom of God is here. He was not saying the kingdom of God is in the near future. He was not saying it's going to be out there someday. He wasn't saying it's up there somewhere. Jesus said the kingdom of God is here. And people began to clearly see that although he made this very bold pronouncement, basically from their perspective, they were still living in this age. People were still sick. There were people still living in poverty. There was still a lot of social injustice. Other kings and kingdoms were ruling the world. You know, all of the things that we think about when we think about living life in this age. And it was really difficult to see how in any real way Jesus' proclamation of the age to come could mean anything, given the fact that how the age to come was supposed to look like didn't seem to be looking like what the anticipation was when Jesus came. So, in fact, what happened in all of this was that, let's diagram it this way. There was undoubtedly this age, when Jesus came and pronounced the age the kingdom of God is here, and began his ministry, what in fact happened was this. He took this age, or the age to come, pardon me, he took the age to come and he laid it right on top of this age, so that this age was continuing at the same time the kingdom or the age to come had in fact been introduced into our historical world. So there is this overlapping of this age and the age to come. And to help put historical boundaries on this, we'll do it this way. This would represent the first coming of Jesus, and this would then represent the second coming. And when we put it this way, you can see that we are living in the tension between the first and second coming of Jesus. Characteristic features of this age are ongoing. War, crime, poverty, all things we've mentioned. But nevertheless, in Jesus, because he has come, he has brought with him, he has introduced already into our present setting, into this age, the age to come. And we live in a very unique space of time when you just step back and realize what has happened. We live in this space between the first advent, or the first coming of Jesus, and the second coming of Jesus. And that is why in this age of the in-between, or living in the in-between age, we don't see the consummation of the kingdom of God. For example, popular among some streams of Christianity or religion to say that if, for example, if you have enough faith you could be healed. Well, does God heal? Well, certainly he does. Did Jesus heal? Well, of course he did. Undoubtedly he did. So there is healing, for example, healing element, healing power that is in this particular space, but it has not been fully consummated. It does not mean everybody is healed. It does not mean that we don't still have physical issues and ultimately die. It simply just has not been consummated. We are not here yet. That will happen at the second coming of Jesus, and all of the images that we think about when we think about that will in fact be fulfilled at this time. So when you are reading Jesus' stories, or you're reading the Gospels, you're reading Paul, you're reading the book of Revelation, this applies to everything. This is a substructure. This is an essential moment in which we need to have a grasp of this basic kind of framework, or eschatological framework, as we might want to call it, in being able to approach and understand what Jesus was doing, how it was written, and how we are to interpret the things, these kinds of things in this context. So we'll be returning to this, and we'll be watching how it plays out and giving further example and illustration of that. But for the moment, as an introduction to the Gospels, and at this moment to the entire New Testament, if this is new for you, take some time to just kind of absorb what that is, because this will be critical to interpreting anything in the New Testament. We've been talking about, obviously, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Just as a reminder, before we close out here, that although they didn't sit together, huddle together, and copy from somebody who was speaking to them, to get as close as they could their stories of Jesus, that does not mean that they were not aware of each other's Gospels. Scholars are not quite sure which came first. It's pretty clear to some, for example, that Mark may have been first and Matthew and Luke may have used that as a source, or the reverse could be true. Maybe Matthew and Luke wrote and then Mark condensed it all. For our purposes, that's irrelevant. What is relevant is that there's a relationship. There is a particular kind of relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What is clear, and I intentionally leave out John, what is clear about Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that they shared or used in some way some of the same literature, some of the same stories. In the example that Mark was written first, Matthew and Luke clearly shared from Mark, or may have shared with each other. But for our purposes, we'll leave all of that to scholars to figure out. What we do know, and for what we need to kind of just keep in mind, is this: that there is a literary relationship between the Gospels. The reason why John is typically not included in that is because it is just as clear that John's Gospel has so many differences, so many ways in which it tells the Jesus story that are so very different than the way they are presented in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's just really clear, Matthew, Mark, and Luke as literary pieces. There's some kind of relationship going on in all of that. John stands kind of as his own. It's written at a different time, different people. And so when you're reading the Gospels, if you see connections between, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, a number of those connections are very well explained by the reality that they were using the same sources. Finally, just as an encouragement to you, as this may have been a lot for a session, just as an encouragement for you, the Gospels are not intended just to be informational, and informational they are. My goodness, how much we get to know. At the same time, it would be fun for you to make a list of things you don't get to know about Jesus. We'll talk a little bit about that next time. But the story, the Jesus event, the whole thing about Jesus is intended to be transformational, to change us, to give us a place where God is working in our life, where our relationship with the Jesus of whom is borne witness in the Gospels, that we are actually in a personal relationship with Him, and the Spirit has come and the Spirit is here and dwelling us. So keep in mind, please, that as you're reading the Gospels, what a great opportunity to see Jesus, to learn, to have information about Him, but also to be changed, to be transformed, and to have new and fresh revelation of what God is doing in your life.